Okay, we just talked about Anschluss, and now let's move on to Sudetenland. Sudetenland is the western region of Czechoslovakia. You see that here. It probably goes without saying that Germany desires this territory as an attempt to promote its aggressive nationalistic policies. And so what happens is after Anschluss, after Hitler had annexed Austria, then it moves on to demand that Czechoslovakia turn over the Sudetenland to Germany, and Czechoslovakia refuses. So now it seems like war is right around the corner, because it seems as though if Czechoslovakia will not just give this land to Germany, that they will invade in order to get it. And so there is a conference arranged in Munich with the attempt to avoid war. Neville Chamberlain, who is one of the major powers in this conference, the Prime Minister of Britain, uses the British policy of appeasement in the Munich conference. All right, this is important because appeasement essentially is a strategy to avoid going to war with a country like Germany, but to keep giving it things that it wants. And so in this example of appeasement, the Czechs are actually forced to give up the Sudetenland to Germany, and Germany agrees then not to go to war and not to continue to kind of threaten this area, right? So Neville Chamberlain actually sees the Munich conference as a success. He declares peace in our time, which we know is ironic because obviously this peace is very short-lived. And it's also obviously very frustrating for the Czechs that the Munich conference basically showed that another country was deciding the fate of the Sudetenland. Britain actually was the country that basically said, hey Czechs, you have to actually give up this land so that we don't go to war with Germany. And also, like appeasement and like what we saw with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, or the remilitarization of the Rhineland, you keep seeing Germany take measures to get stronger and stronger, and these countries like Britain and France sort of standing idly by while it happens. And so appeasement obviously is no exception to this rule. And then you're going to see after the Munich conference, Germany goes ahead and invades the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. So this sort of double crosses, this shows us that Hitler actually is not really going to stop at the Munich conference's decision, right? The Czechs are actually unable to resist this invasion, and so what you're going to find is that on the eve of World War II actually hasn't started yet, but already Hitler has been able to acquire both Austria and Czechoslovakia without actually engaging in formal war. So this is really significant because, again, it's showing us how aggressive Germany is before the war even starts. Okay, so the actual kind of immediate cause of the war is, of course, Germany's invasion of Poland. All right, so here's another region that Germany is interested in. We see that we probably remember from the outcome of World War I that Germany is actually divided. There is East Prussia, right, and then there is the kind of more traditional borders of Germany as we think of it, right, and this is the Polish corridor. This is the region of Danzig, right, which is a little region located in the Polish corridor that separates East Prussia from Germany. And basically Hitler, now, right after it took Czechoslovakia, now it's moving on to Danzig. Hitler demands the Danzig province, and he says that there were ethnic Germans that lived in this part of Poland that were being treated poorly by the Polish. And so he's sort of using this as a pretext for the Germans to take over Danzig. So when he demands this, then Chamberlain, who again felt sort of double-crossed after the Munich conference when Germany went ahead and invaded Czechoslovakia anyway, Chamberlain basically says that Britain now will fight in order to protect Poland, and Hitler, of course, realizes that war is very much possible, but he wants to avoid a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east. All right, and so this is right before the war starts, much to the surprise of countries like Britain and France. The Germans actually sign an agreement with Russia called the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. They signed this in August of 1939, and what this does is it says that Russia is not going to attack Germany if Hitler invades Poland. All right, because it seems like Hitler's about to invade Poland, and obviously Hitler's afraid of what lies to the east, whether or not Russia would attempt to intervene. And so with this German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, this is huge because this means that A, Hitler's going to avoid a two-front war, and B, it kind of gives Hitler the not permission per se, but it gives him the incentive to now invade Poland without worrying that he's going to get that he's going to have a military response from both the East and the West. The other thing that this aggression pact, or this non-aggression pact, does is it's a private promise between Germany and the Soviet Union that after Poland is invaded, that Germany and the Soviet Union will partition Poland between them. And again, Western countries like Britain and France are really shocked about this agreement, first of all, because Hitler and Stalin were sort of arch enemies up until this point. But I guess this shows us, if anything, that Stalin feels that this is a good agreement for him because he would gain territory, he would get parts of Poland. And I mean, ultimately, again, it shows us that Hitler is much more interested in acquiring territory and avoiding that two-front war, and not as concerned with Stalin's ideology. So this is huge, and this is sort of what gives Germany the impetus to invade Poland. Okay, so war formally begins when Germany, after that non-aggression pact is agreed to, then Germany invades Poland the next month, September 1st, 1939. And this formally begins World War II. And very quickly afterwards, Britain and France declare war on Germany. So just 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. And this shows us, because of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, this shows us that after Germany invades Poland, just about 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union is going to invade Poland, and then Germany and the Soviet Union are going to jointly occupy Poland, all right, according to this pact, right? Okay, so the beginning strategies of the war. Hitler and the Germans institute a strategy called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. They use this against Poland, and ultimately it is a very fast-moving kind of institution of constant motion, combining their infantry, their tanks, combat engineers, air power. Their effort or their goal is to break through enemy lines at very high speeds and continuously kind of always keeping the enemy in confusion, keeping them off balance, and rapidly pushing the front. The idea behind Blitzkrieg was to avoid the sort of costly trench warfare that we saw in World War I that resulted in so much stalemate. So basically, you know, the idea was to make military campaigns very short and, you know, kind of continuously push the front forward. Blitzkrieg was successful in the invasion of Poland. Ultimately, Germany defeated Poland in about a month. And then very shortly afterward, the Germans used the same strategy to take over Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and then eventually France. All right, and when actually not all of France is taken by the Germans, this map gives you an indication of the part of France that was occupied by the Germans. This light green part of France was the occupied portion of France. This darker green part is what remains. This is called Vichy France. It's named after this city here, Vichy. And essentially, this is the remainder of France that was not taken over by the Germans, and it was effectively a puppet government that eventually is taken over by Germany. So it's important to realize that at the height of the German aggression, even France is effectively rendered sort of helpless, useless during the war, which obviously caused great alarm to all of Germany's other enemies, right? After Germany takes over Denmark, Belgium, Norway, and France, then it's going to move on to Britain, where it's going to experience less success. So the Battle of Britain in September, actually the summer of 1940. This was Germany's attempt to invade and occupy Britain. What they wanted was to, well, I mean, first, before they staged the invasion, Hitler actually talked to, at this point it was Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, and Hitler spoke to Churchill and said that if Britain accepted the fact that Germany was controlling Western Europe, that he would establish peace with Britain. But Winston Churchill refused this, and then afterwards, Hitler planned a massive invasion of England. It was called Operation Sea Lion, and the attempt was for it to be an amphibious attack of Britain, combining air raids and of course significant naval campaigns also on the British shore. The attempt was first to soften up Britain by massive aerial bombing, so you had tons of planes flying over Britain attempting to bomb it by air. But the British were able to defect this to a certain extent because they had radar technology that was able to detect where the Germans' air attacks were coming from. So this is very, very important to realize that if it were not for radar, maybe the British would not have been successful in warding off the Germans in the Battle of Britain. Ultimately, Hitler's, it was called a Blitz, his attempt to bomb London ultimately failed, and by September of 1940, Hitler is going to call off the invasion of Britain. Now, this is going to be huge because later in the war, one of the significant turning points, D-Day, is going to be able to be successfully launched from Britain. If Britain had fallen to the Germans, D-Day would not have been a possibility, and the war could have certainly turned out differently. So it's huge that England does not fall to the Germans in this period in 1940. So Battle of Britain is a failure on the Germans' part. Okay, then the Germans turn towards the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, as it's called. So this starts in the summer of 1941, and this is a very good example of, again, one of the sort of tenets of Mein Kampf that Hitler wrote about, called Lebensraum, or living space, right? Hitler wants to expand Germany's borders, provide more places for ethnic Germans to live, right? And he sees expanding into the Soviet Union as a way to do that. Most historians argue that by invading the Soviet Union, this was one of Hitler's greatest mistakes. In a way, it's sort of tantamount, you could say, to Napoleon's Moscow campaign, if you remember that from the Napoleonic Wars. And actually, the result is very similar. The Soviets actually utilize again, just like in Napoleon's Moscow campaign, they utilize a scorched earth campaign, which means that they basically destroy anything of value as they withdraw away from the German invasion. This means that the Germans are going to keep going further and further inland in search of the Soviets, but they're not going to be able to get any new supplies, they're not going to be able to get any new food, because every single village that they pass by has been burned by the Soviets. All right, so this is going to be huge. By the winter of 1941, the Germans are going to be at the gates of Moscow. They're also going to be laying siege to Leningrad. So, okay, Moscow, the capital, Leningrad, which was St. Petersburg, they just renamed it. All right, so they're pushing on these major cities, but they get stalled for about 2 years. All right, and this is huge because they're drawn so far into Russia without enough supplies, without enough people. Ultimately, they're not able to conquer these major cities, and this is going to be a huge, huge mistake on the part of the Germans to push so far into the Soviet Union. Also, you're going to see that there's a really significant amount of Soviet nationalism against the Germans. At this point, Soviets are going to start to refer to World War II as the Great Patriotic War of the Fatherland, and so it sort of demonstrates how much Soviet nationalism actually existed against German invasion. All right, so that Scorched Earth campaign shows you nationalism in itself. They're actually willing to destroy their own property to stop the Germans from taking their land. Now, the U.S. involvement is also very crucial as a turning point of the war, but it's important for us to realize that the United States was neutral until December of 1941 with the Pearl Harbor attacks. But it was militarily neutral. That doesn't mean that economically it didn't play some role. Starting in 1941, the U.S. was starting to aid both Britain and the Soviets. Right, so after the invasion of the Soviet Union, and of course the Battle of Britain in 1941, the Americans were aiding both of these countries through their Lend-Lease Act, which basically made it so that the U.S. could aid militarily and financially these two countries, but they weren't actually fighting, but they also weren't neutral, you could say, because of the Lend-Lease Act. But then the neutrality of the United States completely ends after the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th of 1941, right? Shortly after, the U.S. is going to enter into the war. But interestingly, the Germans make another big mistake here, because the Germans actually decide to invade, or to declare war, that is, on the U.S. on December 11th of 1941. Now, because the Japanese had just bombed the United States in Pearl Harbor, presumably the U.S. would have focused its attention on the Japanese. But because the Germans declared war on the U.S., they focused their attention instead on defeating Germany, which is a huge mistake for the Germans. All right? And then in a moment we'll talk about the formation of the Grand Alliance, which also shows us how so many countries are now effectively joining forces against Germany. But essentially, major turning point when we see the U.S. get involved in the war, and also, of course, at this point, Germany was weaker because of its persistence into Russia.